You know, I'm actually getting used to seeing some of these familiar faces now from week to week on this Friday afternoon Zoom. So I see Daryl and Sam and Millie, who I recognize, and Uzma as well. So it's good to see you again. Oh, and there's Maddie as well, and Peace, and Laura Swift. Okay, so Becca and Chris, will I wait another minute before we kick off?
So, no, John, you're ready to go. Sorry, I was just doing the spotlight.
Fantastic.
Yeah, no, ready for you to go, John. Sorry.
Very much. Well, welcome everyone to the third of our practical publishing seminar series with Manchester University Press and Creative Manchester. My name is John McAuliffe, and I'm delighted to be introducing my colleague and friend, Ellah Wakatama. Ellah has been Senior Research Fellow here at the university for the last number of years, and we're really, really delighted to have Ellah working here. I've seen Ellah presenting events in the past and been very impressed by them, but it was at an event here in Manchester with her friend Jennifer McCumbee, where I began to put the pieces together to find a way to bring what it is that Ellah does into contact with what we want to do here at Manchester. And at that event, it became clear exactly how much the relationship with Jennifer McCumbee and with the publication of the novel Chintu had been part of a long-standing editorial relationship which Ellah had nurtured and which brought the book, that brilliant novel, to so many readers. So that's one of the stories I might come back to Ellah about that kind of relationship. But I want to say, first of all, that Ellah is editor-at-large at the terrific Canongate Press. She was the founding publishing editor of the Indigo Press. She's previously been a deputy editor of Granta magazine. She has edited journals and anthologies like Safe Houses, which you can look for and enjoy. She's the chair of the AKO Caine Prize for African Writing and serves as a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund as well, an organisation which I have seen be transformed over the last number of years, and I put a lot of that down to Ellah's good influence as well. So Ellah has had a kind of a long career in publishing and has worked in many different roles there, which is why I'm so pleased that she's going to be able to talk to us this afternoon. And I wanted to start, though, Ellah, by asking you a little bit about, before all of these roles that I'm talking about how you found yourself, how you found your way into publishing initially.
Okay, that's both an easy and an incredibly difficult question. But first of all, hello, everyone. Really lovely to be here with you. I think that the fundamental is that I've always been a reader. Books have always been the most important thing to me. I don't know if some of you will recognize yourselves, but I was always the child reading underneath the covers after lights out. I went to boarding school, so everything was very strict, or reading under the desk during Afrikaans lessons or something like that. So that's the fundamental. And I should also say that my dad is a novelist and a publisher as well. I never intended to be a publisher. I wanted at first to be a war correspondent and then to be a management consultant. So after I did my degrees in America, and I realized that you actually had to be able to count or understand numbers to do management consultancy, I thought, oh, maybe that's a mistake. I did lots of jobs, John, and I actually only came into publishing in my 30s. And that was a result of being really unhappy professionally and thinking, how can I make my job interesting to me? And my then husband and our daughter said to me, it had to be books. And actually I should have known all along. So that's when I decided. And the first thing I did was to get a temp job. And I think my way in is no longer possible because, I'm 55 now. So what, 20 24 odd years ago, temp agencies were hired by publishers. So I was able, through a temp agency called Julie Fisher, I got several jobs. I think the one I walked out of was Reader's Digest because I just couldn't see the point. And then I got a job and I temped at Penguin for a year. And it actually was the very best apprenticeship. I mean, it was frustrating because after a year, I still didn't have a job, but it meant that I worked in every single department. So Frederick Warren, which is Peter Rabbit, Rosie and Jim. It was the very early days of internet orders. And so one of my wonderful jobs was processing the internet orders for Rosie and Jim and communicating with the clients. It meant that by the time a year was over and Penguin was hiring a new classics professor, they needed somebody who knew the whole company really well. And because I'd been phoning every Friday to say, hi, it's Ella, do you have a job for me? They were like, okay, leave us alone, here's a job. And that was great. So it's a bit of an unorthodox way in, but I think that year of just learning about the business was invaluable for me.
And Ella, I guess a kind of a follow-up question to that is one that I've also been asking our previous speakers, which is about the publishing industry that you started to work in, and that sense of being able to go in and work in so many departments gives you a real overview. But what have been the big changes that you've seen? Like, you know, because you've worked at the big conglomerates as well as at the independent presses. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the difference between the two of them, and then also about what has changed most, you think, over the last over these 20.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to make really clear, and I feel I used to be really uncomfortable talking about this, but I feel more comfortable about it now because things have changed. But it was very easy for people to see me as the temp, somebody with administrative skills. It was almost impossible for them to see me as the editor, and that's what I wanted to be. There were no other Black people working anywhere. In the post room, I had mates in the post room, but other than that, I couldn't see myself. That continued for a long while. That's a change that has happened. And I have to say with a lot of pride, actually, that a lot of the work that I've had to do in the last 20 years has been around just making publishing houses look more like the rest of our society, as in some people of color in there somewhere. And that's been a constant battle. And I think that we're now at the stage where we see a greater volume of people who are of color from immigrant communities who are working at different levels in publishing. I mean, a lot of them are still in junior positions, but it reflects in the kinds of books that we have. If you look at the Forward Prize, for example, and just see year on year in our time, the number of Black and Asian, and indeed working class poets, because I think the struggle has not just been about race, it's also been about class in publishing. And, I think that anybody who's concerned with it has always known that when you diversify the publishing industry, you also diversify the books that are available to readers. And to me, that's the biggest change. I do very well in corporates, John. I'm very good at being in big organizations. So Penguin and Random House were very good for me at the beginning of my career and actually to reach a certain point. But I really feel after that I was very clear, certainly at the end of my time with Jonathan Cape, of what I wanted to do. And luckily the Granta job came at a moment where I had itchy feet. And that allowed me to work within a smaller publishing house, but also working on Granta magazine was a different kind of editing. It was, at first I thought it would be a doodle because I thought, oh, it's just doing 4 books a year really, and I've done more than that. It's something entirely different. It's like doing 4 anthologies a year. But that allowed me to work with writers I really loved and admired, and that was really good. So a lot has changed. One, the makeup has changed. I think the positions of power still haven't changed. I think there's still some cynicism attached to how people outside the standard canon are published or curated, as it were. But it seems to me that it's actually, this moment in time is a tipping point where there's a lot more openness and a lot more recognition that different kinds of brains will bring different kinds of books, which attracts different kinds of readers, and we all get paid.
I like that. And I should say as well that I'm talking to you today from the Carcanet offices in Manchester, which I think have really benefited in disproportionate ways from the shift in emphasis at the forward prizes, and have won almost half of them in the last decade because of the kind of the pressure that they have put on trying to change the picture about who gets read and where the readerships are as well. Ellah, could you talk a little bit about this fabulous title, Editor at Large, and talk to us about what does work mean when you're an editor at large for Canongate?
It means that I sweep into work in a red velvet cape, John. That's basically what it means. On a serious note, for me, the business of publishing is political. It really is. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because we talk a lot about, obviously, the writing is important and, the building of culture is important. But I'm Zimbabwean, so I come from a place in the world where at different times, what you write can land you in jail. What you write can mean that you're dead, basically. And this is really true. My own father's been in prison several times because of his own writing. So for me, it's never been just about a nice book to relax with, although that's very important. And the reason I ended up as editor at large at Canongate was because I wanted to do other things. It seemed to me that working as an editor was not going to build the kind of world that I wanted to see. And I think that I was at a point, I'm not going to say I was lucky enough. I've stopped using language like that. I'd worked hard enough to get to the point where I had choices. And so when Canongate approached me and asked what I would want to do, I sort of described the kinds of books that I wanted to publish, but also said that I still wanted to have time to teach, to work on editorial developments in African countries and so on. And it suited them really well. And so it is absolutely a dream job. For 2.5 days a week, I'm at the Canongate offices. I have an assistant and I commission books that are really specific to me, but also contribute to the editorial conversations wider than that. It does mean I get to dodge a lot of meetings, which was my my intention all along. But it also means that I'm involved in the business, but I can also take my energies into other spaces that are of interest to me, that are part of the same ecology.
Great. I guess one of my kind of questions about this is I'm thinking about, say, the kinds of book that you're looking for, and about how genre is neither here nor there. So you're looking at essays like Kai Miller's brilliant book, which it's just had some great news in the US for that lately. But you're working with fiction, and you're working with memoir, and you're working with nature writing as well. I just wonder, I guess that traditionally the divisions between genre were really quite dividing, but that's not the case. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work across genres.
Yeah.
Also maybe in Audible as well, of course, you're doing the audio, you've done all that too.
I've always, that's the way I've always read, John. I always, as a child, read whatever was there. And I think my reading life started off with the Narnia stories. And so the idea that these things could live in my head and on the bookshelf, but they couldn't be something that I worked every day towards was kind of, didn't make any sense to me. I have to say that at the beginning of my publishing career, it was history and modern classics. Two things that I really love. And that was a very good grounding, because if you're working with estates, then you have to learn a lot about sort of how you reissue books, how old books work in new markets, and that whole idea. So I had always worked in fiction and nonfiction. And then when I came to my commissioning role, because my very specific interest was in Black writers, it was about getting those stories, and they were writing in different forms. But I have to say that time was very much literary fiction. It's only in the last, I think, 6 years or so, what I've really been able to indulge myself in genre fiction. And it goes back to what I said, that for me, publishing is a political act. And so if I could give you an example, I have a love story about two young men growing up in Damascus in Syria in the last 15 years. And one of them goes to Canada. And it's this beautiful love story that has a ghost in it as well. Now, you could say that was a gay story. You could say it was a refugee story. For me, it's my perfect kind of story, because you have a gorgeous love story, which is universal. The fact that it's a gay love story brings in all kinds of social and political implications, especially in that part of the world. And it's a refugee story. So all of those things reflect to me the complications of people's lives. And so that book is as political as Kai Miller's book, which is as political as Ayobami Adebayo, the author of Stay With Me, whose new book I've just finished work on. And that book is about income inequalities and crime in Nigeria. So it's having one coherent idea of what I want to put out in the world, what I want on my bookshelf, and then using my sort of curating it as an editor, my list then reflects that. And also, I don't understand why anybody just wants to read about people like them. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So I want to publish as much as I can about publishing the world. I want to read the world.
That's great, and I think that's exactly right. That sense of imaginative traveling, and is what we rely on publishers as our resource for that. And I've got a few questions, and please everybody do pop questions in the chat for Ellah. And Sabira asks how exactly. this is a very, very practical question. How exactly did you make that move from temp to editor, and how does that work in terms of the hierarchies and networks of publishing?
So, Sabira, I don't want anyone to think they can use this as a template. I think the times are very different, but I think some of the things that I can now look back on and think, okay, these are characteristics may be helpful to you. Of course, at the time, one is just doing these things blind. I am incredibly pig-headed and stubborn, and I also grew up in America and in Zimbabwe, both places where, as a young Black girl, you had to face racism head on, especially in Zimbabwe before independence. That means that if somebody tells me I don't belong somewhere, it actually doesn't mean anything to me. It really is, this is where I want to be, and I will make a space for myself. You have to be really sure that you're in the right place. And also, I think in terms of publishing in the right division, all too often people think that editorial is the only place to be. And it may sound a tiny bit smug me saying this as an editor, but actually I value my colleagues in sales as much. And without their support, I wouldn't be able to sort of have any of the successes that I've had. My colleagues in marketing can make all the difference for my writers. And then we all know that publicity can do the same. And so I think that for me, in the end, trying to answer your question more directly, when I say I phoned human resources every Friday, I really mean it. I would work in any department they sent me to, and every Friday I would phone and say, I'm still here, do you have a job for me? And in the end, it worked because I had built up enough experience. I just wouldn't go away. So
very good.
I don't know if that's at all helpful.
I think it's a great, and one of the interesting things I think is that has come up also in what Luke and Simon were talking about in relation to, especially I suppose in terms of sales and in marketing, and about how crucial they are to the story of how books find readers, and how you get that new knowledge into other people's hands, which I guess is part of the passion that drives publishers. Now, Uzma. Hi, Uzma. Uzma asks about how does commissioning work, and she wants to know, do you do call outs? Do you call on known writers who are established, or how does the work come to you, and where do you go looking for it?
That's a brilliant question. Can I just answer something I saw come up? Yes, the author is Danny Ramadan, whoever asked about the author I was talking about. The Clothesline Swing is his first book. His second book is called The Foghorn Echoes, and it's out next year. So yes, buy it. I think that being in a position where the books I wanted to see were not on the bookshelf was actually very good for me. It was a source of frustration, but it also meant that I was seeking out books in a very specific way. And just to give you an example, when I first moved to England 30 odd years ago, and I would go into the bookstore, I'd have to walk to the back because that's where the Black writers, the queer writers, and the SF writers were. And those are the people I needed. And so I always knew to go back, but that made no sense whatsoever. And so when I started out in publishing, I knew that, you know, the general way is that you get to know agents. Agents bring you the kinds of books you probably like. You read through them and you choose them. It's the way that things have worked for a long time. And by and large, it works very well, except that either the agents would send me any Black writer they had, regardless of what they were writing, or two, they didn't have any Black writers on their books. So I had to go looking for those. And that started off a pattern that I think has really benefited me in that I did lots of work with Spread the Word. So if I was asked to speak to any kind of community literary endeavor, I would say yes, and I'd go and do it. And one of my most successful authors who actually reached #1 on Kindle Amazon last week, just saying, is Jared McGuinness. I met Jared at a Spread the Word event, maybe 15 years ago, and knew he was incredibly special and just didn't let go. And I have quite a few writers who I'm not able to let go of. And Jared's a wonderful example of how that kind of long-standing relationship and encouragement can result in something amazing. And, you know, The Coward is doing really well, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book. So I've always gone elsewhere. I do pre-COVID, I did lots of work on the African continent in different countries, teaching, giving workshops, running short story surgeries and so on. I find writers there too. I think that is really important. The way the machine works it does work, but it doesn't ensure that those people who don't find access easy are going to make it. And often the most interesting stories are coming from places where the idea that your story could turn into a book is almost impossible. And I think that opening up those doors and holding them open is so beneficial for all of us readers.
And I should say as well that, you know, Ellah's work with Jared has continued. He did a brilliant event with us after The Coward came out last year, which is up on the Centre for New Writing's Blackboard site for any of you who want to catch up and find out how that conversation went. Chris asks, what are the editorial conversations currently taking place at Canongate in terms of what are the priorities of the press, what are the areas of focus, or what is the consideration of it having a distinct publisher voice, and if that's part of what you're talking about in terms of the conversations with colleagues?
One of the reasons that I did join Canongate at the time I did was because I've always really admired the fact that they did books that were a little bit off the beaten path. They were unashamedly quirky and quite cool. At the same time, their books had messages and they seemed urgent and important. And there was a wide range. It wasn't constrained into one specific thing. I love all of that in an independent press. The editorial conversations that we're having right now, obviously the ones that I'm mentioning are the ones that are of most interest to me, so a colleague may prioritize others. We are really concerned with making our range of publishing sustainable. And so it's very much, and I don't think every independent publishing house does this, but you know, the reason one starts up an independent press is because you have a specific thing you feel is lacking elsewhere. And so that idea can sometimes overwhelm the business side of it. And the business side is really important because if you can't pay editors who have children to feed, then, you know, there are no books and all of that. So I think that combination becomes really important. And so therefore, if we say that we are pushing to publish a range of people, and I think we're really good at Canongate, because one of the things that we've started doing is counting. So before each editorial meeting, we look and see how many men we've commissioned, how many women we've commissioned, how many non-binary we've commissioned, and then look at the races. This can be really uncomfortable sometimes, but unless you do it, you just have this general idea of goodwill, and you actually never achieve a true, can you tell that I'm trying not to use the word diversity because it feels so meaningless, but that's how you achieve a true range and real kind of insight into the culture you're reflecting, but also the culture you're trying to make. And so that's one of the things. The other editorial conversation is, I guess, one that's relevant to wider society, is who is writing the book. So I'm sure you all remember that brilliant book, Curious Incident of the Dog, Mark Haddon. I loved that book. And I think for many of us, it was an introduction to the idea of autism. In 2021, we would be looking for an autistic writer to write that book. When Mark did it, it was a time when I don't think we even thought that way. And I think that's one of the things that's changed majorly. It's who is writing the book. So if a book comes in, for example, I had one recently on an aspect of African history. I, as an editor, I'm going to look first for an African academic or historian to write that book for me, because the time for somebody else to tell that story is long past. We've had that version. So those, I think, are the most interesting discussions, because they don't necessarily mean telling one group of people to be quiet. It's about finding those voices that will fill out the picture, not just telling the same story over and over again. Those are some of the discussions going on. And then there's always the brilliant commercial discussion of, is this book going to be a hit? And not every book needs to be a hit. Some books are there to be like massively commercially successful, because then it allows you to experiment with smaller things that may not have stood a chance beforehand.
That's terrific. And it's really insightful, I think, for everybody to know about kind of how decision making, how careful the decisions are at a publishers. And I think, Chris, that probably reflects your own sense of things as well. Daryl, I'm going to ask Daryl. Daryl has a question which actually it touches on this, I think, and on Canongate's role. And it is, how have you found your instinct to publish books that you are more interested in, and how does that fit in with wider commercial and target-driven aspects of the publishing culture? And then Daryl asked the question, do you have to make a case for some books? And I like that. That's very clearly true, isn't it, Ellah? But how do you convincingly drive in the case? Obviously, having a #1 Amazon hit, which Jared's book, is going to make people feel extremely comfortable with your decision making. But when you're starting out, how do you make that case?
Well, I mean, you'd think now everything I wanted would happen, but it doesn't, which is incredibly frustrating. That is part of the magic of an editorial process, though, is that it can be a really good thing in that you have to defend every single book to your colleagues, first in editorial, and then more generally throughout campaigns, and then finally the financials, which is always the hardest part. The first thing that helps with that is choosing where you work. I think that one of the things I was really lucky to have when I started out was that because I knew I could always temp, I didn't have to take the first job that was offered to me. And I knew I wanted to work at Penguin, because those bookshelves looked most like my bookshelves. And so that's where I wanted to be. And that's how I tell prospective authors to choose their publisher, is you have to start with your bookshelf, and even more so if you're thinking of entering publishing. And I'll just give you an example. When I left Penguin after maternity leave, I was unemployed. And one of the agreements I had with Penguin that haven't been made redundant was that I would get introductions to people I wanted to meet. So I honestly looked at my bookshelf and counted colophons to see whose books I owned the most, or which ones I loved the most, and they were Jonathan Kay books. So I asked to meet Dan Franklin, and I had gone to just do an information interview with him, and he asked if I'd come and work for them. So I think that tuning yourself into the publisher who best reflects your own taste. And then now there's a lot of arrogance involved, because you have to believe that you're a good enough reader, that you know how stories work and how other people will respond. And it's not an empty kind of arrogance, although I think we have to admit it is a kind of arrogance. It's not empty because, you know, if as a child or a teenager, you're reading a novel a day easily, and you're reading critically and you're thinking about the books, then you are probably, you know, one, an abnormal reader, but two, a really experienced reader. And more than thinking, oh, what I love, everyone else will love, I think for me, well, I know that for me, there was just so much to do because none of the books I needed were on those shelves, or there were too few of them. So for me, my work was really clear. I think it may be hard in other situations, but it's about developing a distinct style as well, because although John is right in saying that my books cross genre, they're international and so on, there's a very firm, thick bit of rope tying them all together. And they all make sort of coherent sense. And so, sort of like, you know, when you get dressed and you're wearing things by different designers, you know, a little bit of Primark, the Vivienne Westwood, and then, I don't know, something from Asda, whatever, you know. But at the same time, the aesthetic is still your own. You still look like you. And that also develops over time. And it's willing to be questioned. And there's nothing worse than wanting to buy a book that you know everyone else will love it. And your editorial colleagues don't agree with you. Sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're right.
Very good. Thank you. That's another terrific and enlightening answer, Ellah. I wondered if I could ask you a little bit about readership, you know, and about your sense of what it is about readers that has changed. You know, or if there are changes in terms of who is reading the books now, and you know, where the readership has changed. It's one of the things I always find very interesting every year when, you know, our students come in, our first year students versus our MA students and our PhD students, are trying to figure out what are their common books. And one of my odd feelings is that as readers, they seem to have less in common now, maybe, and that's a good thing possibly. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that kind of segmentation of kind of different kinds of readers, if you could speak to that.
I have no proof of this, right? But I don't think readers have changed that much. I think that readers have always been capable of so much more than publishers gave them. So, for example, when I first was bringing African writers into Penguin Classics and also into Jonathan Cape, I had very little money to spend on those books because the sales department couldn't see any track record of these books reaching an audience. Now, the fact that those books had never tried to reach the audience was not taken into account. And yet you find now that when you publish something like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or Ayabami Adebayo, you don't for a minute think that your book group at Tunbridge Wells won't get it because they want that book. A lot of the work was done by the publishing of Indian writers, because if you all remember when Rohinton Mistry, Jhumpa Lahiri, all of those writers we love, Salman Rushdie, were publishing at that moment in the 90s, they stopped being foreign writers. Nobody felt they couldn't understand a book because it was set in Delhi. We all, you know, as readers, we all would pick up A Suitable Boy or A Fine Balance and expect to be drawn into that world. And I think the same has happened with other demographics. As publishers have become braver and more inclusive in the kind of work that they publish, the readership grows because the readers are always out there. So I think that any fault has always been with the publishers for lack of imagination. One of the things that's also changed now is how readers connect with their books. And so the fact of having so much stuff online means that readerships can be more international than they were before. Books can travel much further. Readers have more access to their favorite writers through being able to watch things online. My daughter, for example, TikTok tells her what to read. And before that, it was Instagram, you know, and the number of books that I have to sort of then order for her based on, oh my God, have you seen this? And that to me is all really, really exciting because it just opens things up a little bit and completes stories in a really interesting way.
That's great. I guess one of the things that I guess I'm thinking about especially is genre fiction and the way that maybe the students are much more open about how they read genre fiction alongside kind of the different spines of literary fiction that they'll have come across often in an educational context. But maybe it's how fantasy and genre have morphed into so many subgenres, so that it was George R.R. Martin and it was various others who they did have in common. But now, well, it's just me. I'm just lost when I'm into the subgenres of fantasy, I think. Very good. I have another question from Chris here, which is about and it's something again which has kind of arisen in previous weeks, which is about your relationship as an editor with reviewers and literary editors and features editors. And I guess one of the things that Luke also talked about last week a little bit was about the prize culture alongside that, and the various prizes, and how important it is for you to about how important it is to you to sustain publicity networks.
Yeah, I think it falls less upon editors than it does upon campaigns directors or publicity directors. At the same time, the kind of relationships I keep with agents are very much like the kind of relationships I keep with literary editors and with broadcasters as well, because obviously you're part of the same wider community, the conversations are the same, you see the same people. But also, I want my books to be reviewed. And so we've all seen those books pages in newspapers shrink quite rapidly. We're having to focus, and I think rightly so, on pivoting a little bit and not depending on the big lit ads, but also really getting to know some of those Instagram book bloggers who I think can be amazing, and they can really shift a book. I'm not going to talk about TikTok because I can't pretend to understand it. And every time anyone over the age of 25 tries to talk about TikTok, they sound so out of the loop. So I know it's really important, but I'll leave younger brains to deal with that. But I think that all of those things have meant that there's sort of more ways of talking about books, and people are going to different spaces. So it's not the observer that's going to tell you which books to read immediately. You could be a reader who gets all of his advice on what to read from a favorite internet magazine or from indeed social media. So I think all of those things have changed. So the focus isn't necessarily only on literary editors. But I think that whole culture of sort of writing about books and blogging, for me, feels like it's exploded just in the last 4 years. And even if I'm thinking only about my African writers and how there are so many reviews and journals that are actually working at a very high level, offering a critical response to that work, that makes me really happy and excited.
I think there's something, isn't there, as well about that? There's a sense of a scene emerging around writers, that like writers emerge from little groups of other writers, from journals and from nights, and that excitement and that energy seems to be able to bubble up a little faster, maybe in a really positive way, and that is to do with the online networks that they have access to, and that they, a little bit like it happened in music maybe a little bit earlier. But I do think it's kind of one of the really exciting things for poetry as well as for fiction.
Absolutely. And about the prizes, John, I run a prize. I really believe in them. The most important thing is they give money to writers. I can't think of anything more important. But then also it creates a kind of valorization that encourages other writers. And I know that there is a school of thought that you shouldn't pit writers against each other. I really believe in competition. I don't believe in that kind of everyone's a winner nonsense. Somebody is the winner, and it's great. And it's great if it's your writer. And if it's not, then you learn something. But I think that there is something sort of celebratory about, one book rising. What's also interesting is how judging committees are changing. I think that when I judged the Booker Prize, I was the first African to ever judge it, but that's no longer an unusual thing now. And that was only in 2015. So now we're in 2021 and seeing, a different range of people as judges for something like the Booker Prize or any other prize is now not not that unusual. That's taken lots of work, and it also makes a massive difference to who's winning the prizes. And I think that with those innovations, I get really excited. I mean, I went to the Bailey Gifford the other day, and it was just such a thrill to see that wide range of books that would not have been there just 10 years ago. Yeah.
I think it's one of the growth of different prizes has been helpful. And but it was one of these amazing things for me to look at literary fiction, when the Folio Prize came up and sort of just that began to break the idea of there being one prize, maybe, prize to rule them all. But there it has really, there's so many different opportunities now, and no more than the online networks and discussions which also can give books other chances to find new readers of different kinds of books.
Exactly.
Do that as well. Well, I'm going to just ask our attentive audience, and I can see many of you there. If you have any more questions for Ellah, just please do put your hand in the air, or if you'd like to call it out rather than write it in. And I'm going to just do something terribly boastful now, which is the joys of working in Carcanet. Somebody just brought me a coffee. Oh, how great is that? So Chris asks again, I just have an interesting question about, how far has the publishing got to go before it can claim to be an industry that celebrates diversity. So again, it's sort of an interesting, it is changing, as you say, but does it, how much for, it's on its way to change, but how is it going to be possible to sustain and maintain that pace of change?
That's such a hard question for me to answer. I'm kind of relentlessly optimistic in a kind of passive aggressive way. I'm determined that we've reached a point where there's such volume of those people who were missing before, that diversity that was missing before is in such volume now that it would be hard the industry would have to work really hard to make it so awful for those people to all go away. In the past, it's because there hasn't been that volume. And so, for years I was involved in different mentoring programs, and it would be so disheartening when the people I mentored would finally succumb to their parents' wishes and move into the city or wherever, and get a job that actually made them some money. That has changed because of volume. So one would like to think that means that we've reached that tipping point. What my real concern is where diverse authors, which isn't even grammatically correct, where diverse authors get funneled into a single publishing house. I cannot tell you how much I am against that idea. I can see how sometimes that kind of funneling in terms of prizes or scholarships can ensure that you pay attention. But when it comes to the publishing of books, if at the end of a 5-year period, an imprint that's only for Black authors or only for working class authors or only for queer authors doesn't work, it becomes those identity markers that have made the imprint fail, not the individual books, if you see what I mean. So if a literary imprint, let's say Jonathan Cape were to fail, nobody would say, oh, well, white men don't sell. It would be because these individual books didn't work. So that worries me a lot. And I think that when one thinks of at the very beginning, thinking of things changing, I know that I didn't mean I want a bigger bookshelf at the back of the bookstore. I meant I want those books throughout the bookstore, filed alphabetically or according to genre, not according to those identity markers, if that makes sense. So while I'm really optimistic, I don't know. I think that we have to wait a couple of years and see if those moves by the corporates were cynical or not. My fear is that they probably were cynical. My hope is that because the books are making money, that that commercial imperative and commercial reward will make people do the right thing.
It's great. So just 2 more questions. Daryl asks about, you were talking about what is the kind of the thread or the rope that defines the work across genres that you do. And given, you know, your sense of what you have done, where do you see your interest going in future?
So recently I've been teaching myself YA because I I didn't read YA, and I don't know if it really existed as a genre. Well, maybe it did. I don't feel like I really understood what it meant. And then I kept seeing some of the most exciting science fiction and fantasy coming in that genre across many different subjects. And I felt like the writers there were tackling issues that were really urgent and important in really interesting ways. And so I've been learning about that. And a writer I really adore recently asked if I'd work with her on her next YA book. So I'm really excited about that. Because I could say, yeah, I know all about that. I've read all the books. So that's the area that I'm really interested in. I'm lucky enough to have the chance to start working a little bit more in with crime and science fiction, which I haven't been before. And so that's very interesting to me. I don't know how I could ever sort of narrow it down. And I try not to be too scattered in the way that I do things, but I don't know that I would ever want to narrow it down and say, this year I will only be publishing science fiction from Eastern Europe or something. I'm not sure that would suit me very well. But that direction to keep pushing things that are unashamedly political in surprising forms is very much something that I want to continue.
Thanks, Ellah. Oh, hang on a second, I'm unmuted. Peace asks about the pandemic and about, you know, what it is that you learned about the industry and how you coped with the changes, and if it has affected your sense of, you know, the future of like, as everybody will know, there was this terrible moment when it looked like all the bookshops were closed and the supply lines were down. And there was a very scary moment, which publishers generally thrived across the pandemic. But now there are all kinds of weird and unusual issues with paper shortages internationally and things like that. So I wonder if, you know, what did you learn about these trials and tribulations? And
well, I think on a personal level, one of the important things to know about people who are or have ever been desk editors is that we're actually hermits, and often we're introverts pretending to be extroverts. So the quiet time alone at home was just brilliant for me. I really loved that. The connection with audiences became really interesting. The books that we published early in the pandemic didn't do as well in terms of publicity as they did towards the end, because we'd learned so much in that year about how to do public events, and actually finding that we're not going to go back to events that are just one format, because we lose our wider audience through doing that. Initially, I was really worried because, you know, it's sort of like when you're on a plane and the plane's crashing or somebody's sick, nobody is running up and down the aisle saying, is there a copy editor on board? Is there a commissioning editor on board? I mean, we're not really essential workers, except that we are in terms of knowledge building and culture building. So I think there was a worry across the board. What happened is, as John says, people were buying books and reading books. Publishers ended up doing really well. And I think it was a reminder for us that, you know, the work we do is not just about a kind of entertainment. It was a way for people to, when people had downtime and everything else was taken away from them, one of the things they still wanted to do was to communicate with the world through books. And for me, that was incredibly encouraging. More widely, I think maybe Brexit might damage us more than the pandemic did.
okay, very good, and thanks, Peace, who definitely finds it relatable about introverts pretending to be extroverts. So actually, there are two more questions. So Sam and Ellah teaches on the MA Contemporary Fiction course, so we'll have kind of maybe an aspect on here at Manchester, but it's what impact does the publishing industry have on current academic syllabuses? And do you have a sense of, you know, how the books you publish are being engaged with on that academic side, or is that something that's kind of a little bit off to one side, Ellah?
No, it's actually something I'm really interested in. I think in the last few years, I've started to get requests to help examine PhDs. And that's because people are now writing about the books I've published or the kinds of books I've published in a way that they wouldn't have been maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I've always been really concerned with that critical academic response to the work. And for me, it is a wonderful thing. And I think I'm involved in it to the point that I will always respond if somebody's a PhD student wanting to talk about one of my books. One, it's incredibly flattering, but I think two, that's how a canon is built. And I think that without that critical response, then we're not encouraging a kind of thinking about these books within our wider intellectual culture, as it were. So I think that that's really important. I think that more and more academic writing is willing to be, I think, challenging and original within the academic framework. And that becomes really, really important. I have to say, often I speak to writers about writing about their books. And it was just like, oh, really? I did that? Oh, that's interesting. Is that what I was doing? But I guess that's always the way. And for me, one of the things that's really exciting, looking at contemporary literature, is having access to the writers and the process. And so you can have your theorizing on one level, which is really, really important, that thinking about the book separate from the author is vital. But then if there's ever any chance that I can get my students to meet with a writer afterwards, I think that's really exciting because it gives a specific kind of insight. And it also points to a keen awareness that if I want these books to last, there are these other bits of our literary ecology that also have to be involved in the valorizing and memorializing and archiving of those works and placing them at a certain position in this new canon that we're trying to create.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Thank you. Ambrose Musiiwa, who I know Ambrose has edited a Black Lives Matter anthology during the pandemic. Ambrose asks about how Black Lives Matter and Brexit as two kind of huge cultural. I know you've just touched on Brexit now and earlier, kind of on the changes in the industry, and if Black Lives Matter accelerated or emphasized the need for change in a good way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really difficult one for me. It's something I think about a lot. And so it feels, as a Black African woman working in publishing, that there was a moment in the recent past when George Floyd was murdered, and may his soul rest in peace. It seemed as if it was the first time some of my colleagues in the industry realized that Black people wrote books and read books, and that actually they had to be taken into account. There were some really embarrassing responses, phrases like unheard voices, and you're thinking, well, we're hearing each other. If you can't hear, it's not our fault, because there's a choice to whether you want to hear or to see. And so being called unheard or unseen was frankly really irritating. I got pissed off on so many levels during that moment in time. While I was grateful for the attention, the kind of hysterical scramble afterward made me really mad, as somebody who had sat in editorial meeting after editorial meeting saying publish more Black writers. And then suddenly when there was a world outcry, I mean, obviously one can see how it happens, but that's what I meant about it being kind of a cynical thing, that suddenly everybody wants to publish every writer of color, which is great, but then the books have to be published properly with the same level of seriousness as we've published everything else we've published before, not as special cases. That's not what this all means. So about that whole Black Lives Matter moment, I personally feel that the industry responded with a little too much speed and cynicism, in a way that if they'd actually listened to their colleagues and their writers in the years coming, because lots of Black writers pointed out to some of those agents who were calling out for submissions, saying, yeah, well, I've submitted and you still won't read my work. So suddenly now you want to read it. I can understand that frustration. I would like to see that that moment is translated into something that actually is quite serious. It's not based on any kind of liberal guilt or patronizing guilt or any other kind of cynicism, but really based on excellence comes out of that level of diversity, and we want to be excellent. Can you tell I'm actually a little bit pissed off about this? Yeah.
Thank you, Ellah. We have one final practical question from Maddie, Maddie Hoffman. And Maddie just has a question about how involved you are after commissioning the book in shaping the finished product. And kind of as a rider to that, if the author is working in genre rather than in kind of more experimental or hybrid forms, do you end up working more or less with them?
No, it doesn't matter about the genre. I think that you're looking for different things. So I certainly edit nonfiction differently to fiction. Commissioning is just the beginning of my involvement. My relationship with the author becomes really intense after commissioning. Editing is intense, and it can sometimes take up to a year, where you're going back and forth. And until I release the book to the copy editor, it's definitely on my desk and my responsibility, as is my writer's welfare and how they're dealing with the book. Once it leaves my desk, I'm still responsible in terms of the publishing of it is still headed up by me because I'm the commissioning editor. I know the book and the writer better than anybody else does. But then my colleagues in campaigns and sales do take over to a level, but the editor is always involved. And indeed, after publication, I'm always watching out to see what's happening with my books, or maybe saying, what do you want to do next? If it's worked really well that time around. I think that level of involvement is really, really important. And for me, at least the kind of editor I've always wanted to be and that I am, it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
And in terms of, does it depend on genre? Not really. This is a different way of approaching the book.
Listen, to hear you talk about the writers you work with and to know the books as they come out, Ellah, is to it makes other writers jealous, I think. So it's and I can certainly speak to hearing you talk to writers across genres, kind of at the Novel Voices events that we do, about that relationship and how sustained it is and how it goes on, as you say, after the book into next projects, and it's just and the creative conversation is part of the creative process. I might ask you all to say thank you to Ellah and for what was just a brilliant talk, not just on publishing but on work and doing work which is responsible and speaks to the moment that we live in as well. We are not going to be meeting next Friday. Because there's a UCU strike on, which we're part of, which we're going to be out next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday because of that. And we'll be back the following Friday. And Chris and Becca at MUP will be in touch with the details about that. And we hope that we'll see you then. And that will be with myself and Michael Schmidt talking about work at Carcanet, the poetry press here in Manchester. But thank you very much, Ellah, and have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah.